The wooden fence came down at noon. Gideon Brooks stood in his driveway and watched the crew tear it apart post by post. The same fence he had built with his own hands 8 years ago, the summer after his wife's diagnosis. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He just stood there with sawdust settling on his boots while the excavator idled 20 feet from the tomato beds his daughter still watered every morning. Elena Voss stepped out of a black SUV, dropped a contract on his toolbox, and said 4 words without looking up from her phone. "Sign it, or lose everything." Gideon picked up the pen. He signed. Then he looked at her calm, almost tired, and said, "You have 3 days before this town finds out what you just destroyed." Nobody believed him. They should have. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, the kind where the quiet guy turns out to be right all along, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the beginning. Gideon Brooks was not the kind of man who talked about himself. Ask his neighbors and they'd tell you what they knew. He showed up when things broke. A pipe burst at the Hendersons' place on a January night. Gideon was there with a wrench before the floor dried. The old drainage ditch behind the elementary school collapsed after a storm. Gideon spent a Saturday redigging it with 2 other men from the block. He didn't announce these things. He didn't post about them. He just did them the way he did most things, quietly, thoroughly, and without waiting to be thanked. He was 44 years old, a former construction worker and greenhouse repairman who had spent more years reading soil and water than he had reading anything else. He knew which ground held moisture and which drained too fast. He knew how roots moved underground, how clay shifted after a hard rain, how a single row of trees could slow a flood by hours. This wasn't knowledge he had learned from a textbook. He had learned it the way his father had learned it, and his father before that, by living on the same patch of land long enough to understand its moods. His wife Carolyn had been the one who first called it a garden. To Gideon, it was just the backyard. But she had a way of naming things that made them real, and so the backyard became the garden, and the garden became the place where everything important happened. They built the greenhouse together the spring before she got sick. Her idea, his hands. She wanted to grow tomatoes year-round. He wanted to make her happy. The result was a crooked little structure with mismatched glass panels and a door that stuck in the humidity. And it was the finest thing Gideon had ever built. After Carolyn died, he didn't touch the greenhouse for 3 months. Then one morning, his daughter May, who was 7 years old and took after her mother in the way that made Gideon's chest hurt, asked if they could go check on the tomatoes. So they did. And they kept going back. Over the years, the garden grew into something Carolyn would have loved and probably found a little excessive. There was the vegetable plot, which Gideon had expanded until it stretched the full length of the south fence and which produced more food than he and May could eat. The overflow went to whoever needed it. The Pattersons across the street, the elderly widow 3 houses down, the food shelf at the church on Millbrook Road. There was the retention pond he had dug himself after the flood of 2019, a shallow basin lined with river stone that could hold enough water to keep the surrounding properties dry through a 3-inch rainfall. There were the drainage channels, long, narrow trenches packed with layered gravel and crushed limestone that moved water underground from the high ground at the north end of the property down to the pond and out through a culvert at the southeast corner. There was the windbreak along the east boundary, 8 years of cypress trees standing in a row, their roots so deep and tangled by now that the soil beneath them was a different world than the soil 20 feet away. None of this had been planned on paper. Gideon had built it the way he built everything, incrementally, in response to problems, adjusted season by season until it worked. The Maplewood Senior Living Facility on the next block had not flooded once since 2020. The people who lived there didn't know why. Gideon had never told them. Elena Voss knew the value of everything she had ever acquired, and she had acquired a great deal. At 41, she ran Voss Meridian Development with the kind of focused intensity that made subordinates careful about what they said around her. She had built the company from a regional firm into something that appeared in national real estate publications, and she had done it by making decisions quickly and not second-guessing them afterward. People who worked for her described her as precise. People who competed against her used other words. She was not by nature a cruel person. She simply operated in a framework where sentiment was a liability and momentum was everything. When she looked at a piece of land, she saw potential yield, construction timeline, and projected return. She did not see the history of the ground or the lives organized around it. That was not a flaw in her view, it was professionalism.
Voss Meridian was in trouble.
Not visible trouble, the quarterly reports were still presentable, but the kind of structural trouble that Elena recognized because she had created it. 3 over-leveraged projects in 2 years, a commercial real estate market that had softened faster than anyone predicted, and an investor group that was patient but not infinitely so. She needed a win, a real one, something she could point to. The eco-resort concept had come from her senior strategist. A high-end retreat built on the edge of a small southern town, marketed to wealthy urban professionals who wanted to feel close to nature without actually being inconvenienced by it. The location was ideal. The demographics supported it. The numbers worked, but only if the footprint included the full parcel, which meant the irregular lot on Sycamore Street, currently occupied by a widower, a child, and what her project manager described in his site report as an overgrown mess of vegetable beds and homemade drainage structures. Elena had sent 3 different representatives to buy the property over 5 months. Each returned empty-handed. The owner, one Gideon Brooks, was polite but immovable. He wasn't asking for more money, he wasn't negotiating. He simply said no. Elena reviewed his file herself after the 3rd refusal. Former tradesman, no college degree, modest income, outstanding medical debt from his wife's illness. A man with almost no leverage. She noted almost as an afterthought a handwritten letter he had sent to her office 7 weeks earlier. 3 pages describing in precise detail the drainage function of his property, the location of the underground channels, the capacity of the retention pond, and the risk to surrounding properties if any of these systems were disturbed. Her chief engineer had reviewed it and called it the work of someone with practical experience but no technical background. He recommended proceeding as planned. Elena set the letter aside. Her legal team had found a title discrepancy on the rear portion of the lot, old paperwork never corrected. The kind of thing that cost nothing to find and a great deal to fight. They could file, tie up the property in litigation, and let the debt do the rest. Gideon Brooks couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle. He almost certainly knew it. She authorized the action. She did not read the letter again. The morning Gideon signed, he woke before dawn. He sat at the kitchen table with Carolyn's garden journal open in front of him, a thick spiral notebook she had filled over 3 years of planning and planting. Every page in her handwriting, margins crowded with small sketches of root systems and sun angles, and notes to herself about what had worked and what hadn't. He didn't read it. He just looked at the handwriting for a long time. May came downstairs at 7 and found him there. She poured herself a glass of juice and sat across from him and didn't ask what was wrong. She was 11 now and understood more than he sometimes remembered. After a while, she said, "Are you going to sign it?" "Yeah," he said. She nodded slowly. "Okay." That was all. She trusted him. That was the weight he carried to the meeting. Elena arrived at the property with her attorney and 2 members of her project management team. She was composed, efficient, and gave no indication that she understood what the signing meant to the man across the toolbox from her. Gideon didn't expect her to. He had stopped expecting that hours ago. He read every page of the contract before picking up the pen. Her attorney shifted his weight twice. Elena checked her phone once. Gideon didn't rush. When he finally signed, he straightened up and looked at Elena directly. "You can have the land," he said, "but there are things under it you can't buy." She met his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once the way someone nods when they've decided the conversation is finished. Gideon set the pen down. He carried the potted rosemary from the greenhouse windowsill, the small ceramic planter May had painted when she was 6, and Carolyn's garden journal out to his truck. He was almost to the gate when he stopped without turning around. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he already knows he won't be heard, but says it anyway because some things need to be said out loud. Don't cut the east tree line. Don't fill the pond. Don't touch the gravel channels behind the greenhouse. A pause. You have 3 days before this town finds out what you just destroyed. No one responded. He got in his truck and drove away. The demolition crew arrived at 7 the next morning. Gideon heard about it from his neighbor Frank Delaney, a retired Army sergeant who lived 2 houses down and had spent the better part of 30 years being annoyed by noise at unreasonable hours. Frank called at 7:15, voice flat the way it got when he was working hard to stay calm. "They're taking the cypress trees," he said. "East line, all of them." Gideon sat on the edge of the bed in the rental house, a small, low-ceilinged place on the other side of town that smelled like someone else's cleaning products, and said nothing for a moment. "You want me to go over there?" Frank asked. "No," Gideon said. "Let them work." He heard Frank exhale. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure."
He wasn't sure.
But there was nothing legal left to do, and Gideon had never been the kind of man who made scenes. He got dressed, made May's lunch, drove her to school, and then sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes with the engine running before he pulled out and went back to the rental house. The crew worked fast. By mid-morning, they had cleared the east tree line, stripped the windbreak down to stumps, and started filling the north end of the retention pond with compacted fill. A project supervisor named Dale, who had been in the business long enough to stop caring what he was tearing down, watched the excavator work from the shade of a site canopy and described the property to one of his crew as 11 years of one guy's feelings about dirt. The crew laughed. Dale moved on to the next item on his checklist. By early afternoon, the first problems appeared. An excavator working near the greenhouse sank 6 inches into a pocket of soft ground that hadn't shown on the soil survey. The temporary drainage pipe they'd run along the south boundary backed up with red clay sediment and stopped moving water entirely. The site foreman filed an incident report and flagged it as a soil variance. He recommended a follow-up survey before continuing heavy equipment operations near the greenhouse perimeter. Elena read the report in her car between meetings. She forwarded it to her chief engineer with a single line, "We're on a 48-hour window before the investor walk. Keep moving." He kept moving. That night, Gideon opened Carolyn's journal to a page near the middle. She had sketched the retention pond from above a rough oval, with arrows showing the water flow from the high ground at the north fence down through the gravel channels to the pond basin and out through the culvert. Beside the sketch, she had written, "G says this took him 3 weekends. Looks like it took 3 years. He doesn't know the difference." And below that, in smaller letters, "Whatever happens, don't let this go. It holds more than water." He closed the journal. He set it on the nightstand next to the lamp. From down the hall, he could hear May moving around in her room, the soft thud of her feet, the low sound of music from her speaker. She had not complained once about the rental house. She had not brought up the garden. She was 11 years old and was handling this better than most adults would, and Gideon understood that this was partly because she was strong and partly because she was watching him and doing what he did. He turned out the light. He did not sleep for a long time. The storm came the following afternoon without much warning. It was a standard summer system, the kind that built along the ridge to the west and moved through quickly. An hour of hard rain, sometimes 2, then clear skies by evening. In a normal year, it would have drained through the cypress roots and traveled underground through the gravel channels into the retention pond, which would have absorbed it without incident. The Maplewood Senior Living Facility on the adjacent block would have stayed dry. The low-lying houses on the far side of Sycamore Street would have stayed dry. The whole system had been designed to handle exactly this kind of event, but the cypress trees were stumps now. The north end of the retention pond was filled with compacted earth. The gravel channels were partially blocked where the excavator had crossed them without knowing what it was crossing. The water had nowhere to go. It moved fast once it started off the high ground at the north fence across the construction site, through the gaps where the silt barriers had been inadequately staked, and down the natural grade toward the street. Within 40 minutes, the drainage ditch along Maplewood's west fence was overwhelmed. Muddy water spread across the facility's rear lawn and began pooling against the foundation of the east wing. Elena got the call while she was reviewing presentation materials with her communications director. She was on site in 20 minutes. The scene was not what her engineer's report had prepared her for. It was not a manageable variance. It was mud moving in sheets across a construction zone she had authorized heading toward a building full of elderly residents. She stood at the edge of the site in her good shoes and watched the drainage crew scramble with a pump that was not rated for sediment load and kept choking on the clay. Her chief engineer arrived and stood beside her holding his tablet in a way that suggested the tablet was not helping. "Where's the water going?" she asked. "Currently pooling at the Maplewood East Foundation. We have a pump crew working the south run, but the discharge line is..." "Where should it be going?" He paused. Based on the original topography, there was an underground collection system that routed flow toward the southeast corner of the lot. A series of gravel-packed trenches feeding a central basin. We partially disturbed the trench network during site prep. "Can we restore it?" "Not without knowing the original routing. It wasn't documented. Our pre-acquisition survey didn't capture it because it wasn't a permitted structure. It was built by the previous owner without formal engineering review." He turned the tablet toward her. "There's no schematic, no blueprint. We're looking at a hand-built system that someone designed based on direct observation of this specific land over many years." Elena stared at the tablet. Then she looked at the site at the stumps where the cypress trees had been at the filled-in north basin, where the pond had been at the churned earth crossing the channels that had moved water safely through this property for a decade without anyone filing a report about it. An older engineer named Walter Hayes, who had been on Voss Meridian's contract roster for 12 years and had a habit of saying things other people on staff avoided saying, crouched beside one of the remaining channel sections near the greenhouse and studied the layering of stone. He stood up slowly, the way men his age stood up after crouching. "Whoever built this," he said, not to anyone in particular, "didn't learn it from a textbook. The gravel gradation, the stone sizing, the angle of the run, it's not standard. It's site-specific. Whoever designed this understood what this ground does in a hard rain by watching it do it probably more than once." He looked at Elena. "You're not going to reconstruct this from the outside. You need the person who built it." Elena said nothing. She already knew who that was. She went back to the office. She sat in the meeting her communications director had scheduled and listened to the recommendation she had been half expecting since the pump crew failed. The consultant's name was Preston Ward, and he was good at his job in the specific way that people who manage bad news for corporations are good at their jobs. He laid it out cleanly. The flooding incident created liability exposure. The timing, coming within 48 hours of the property transfer, invited scrutiny. The previous owner had sent a documented warning letter. If that letter surfaced publicly, the company's position became very difficult. "The cleanest path," Preston said, "is to establish that Mr. Brooks failed to disclose material information about the property's drainage characteristics during the transfer process." The room was quiet for a moment. "He sent a letter," Elena said. "A letter is not formal technical disclosure. It's not certified, it wasn't submitted through legal channels, and it contained no engineering documentation. Our counsel believes we can characterize it as the personal concern of a layperson, not a binding disclosure." Elena looked at the table. Around it sat 4 people who were all in various ways waiting for her to make the same decision she had made every other time something difficult needed to be decided. She thought about the pump crew choking on red clay. She thought about Walter Hayes crouching beside the channel. She thought about the Maplewood residents and whether any of them had gotten their floors wet. She said, "Set up the press statement." The statement ran at 6 o'clock. Preston had written it well, calibrated corporate, carefully vague. It expressed Voss Meridian's concern for the affected community while noting that the company had relied on standard due diligence procedures and that questions had arisen regarding the completeness of information provided by the previous property owner. It did not name Gideon Brooks directly. It didn't need to. This was a small town. Frank Delaney saw it on the local news at 6:15. He went to his filing cabinet and found the copy Gideon had given him months ago, The handwritten letter, 3 pages, dated and postmarked to Voss Meridian's corporate office 7 weeks before the contract signing. He photographed every page with his phone and sent them to the local paper and 2 television stations by 6:45. By 8 o'clock, a woman named Ruth Abernathy, who was 83 years old and had lived in the Maplewood East Wing for 6 years, was sitting in a folding chair in the facility's common room, explaining to a reporter's camera that the garden next door had kept her building dry through 4 storms that she could remember, and that the man who maintained it had never once asked for anything in return. Her delivery was unhurried, and her memory was precise, and she looked directly at the camera the entire time. By 9, the story had moved beyond the local stations. Elena's phone ran hot. The investor group sent a message that was polite in phrasing and not polite in meaning. The board chair called and used the word exposure 6 times in 4 minutes. Her communications director, who had written the press statement, sent her a text that said only, "We may need to revisit the framing." Elena sat alone in her office after the last call ended. The building was quiet. Through the window, she could see the lights of the city, which had no opinion about any of this. She thought about what Walter Hayes had said at the site. "You need the person who built it." She thought about the statement she had authorized. She thought about Gideon Brooks standing at his gate telling her not to touch the east tree line, telling her she had 3 days. It had been 3 days. Then the second weather alert came through on her phone. A larger system, faster moving, projected to make landfall over the county by midnight. Rainfall estimates 3 to 4 inches in under 2 hours. She called her site foreman. He told her the pump crew had made limited progress and the silt barriers were not going to hold through a 4-inch event. He told her the Maplewood facility manager had already called the county emergency line. He told her they needed the original drainage schematic. She already knew there was no schematic. There was only one thing left. Elena picked up her keys. The rain started before she reached the highway. Elena drove without GPS. She had looked up the address that afternoon after Walter Hayes said what he said at the site, and she had not let herself think about why she was memorizing it. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the wipers on high and the radio off. There was nothing she wanted to hear. The rental house on Caldwell Street was a small wood frame structure set back from the road behind a gravel drive. One light was on in the front room. Elena pulled up to the curb and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running rain loud on the roof. She had walked into boardrooms where the entire table was against her. She had delivered news that ended partnerships, terminated contracts, dissolved agreements that other people had spent years building. She had done all of it without losing her footing. Standing in front of a door in the rain was not by any objective measure harder than those things. She turned off the engine and got out. Gideon answered on the second knock. He was still dressed, jeans, a worn flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, work boots he hadn't taken off yet. He looked at Elena on his porch, soaked through, no umbrella, no aide standing half a step behind her. He looked at her for a moment the way he might look at a crack in a foundation, noting its position, estimating its depth, and then he said nothing and waited.
"I was wrong,"
Elena said. Her voice was steady. She had decided on the drive over that she would not perform this. She would just say it. "About the land, about the letter, about the statement we put out tonight." She paused. "I need you to come back." Gideon leaned against the doorframe. Behind him, May appeared at the end of the hallway, bare feet, a book in her hand, and stopped when she saw the woman at the door. Gideon didn't turn around. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you need me to come back to save the project or to save the people in that building?" Elena held his gaze. It was not a complicated question. It felt like one because the honest answer had a cost she was still calculating, even now standing in the rain with her good jacket ruined. She stopped calculating. "To save the people," she said. "The project can go to hell." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked past her at the street, at the rain moving through the cone of the streetlight in sheets at the water already running fast along the curb. He was thinking about Carolyn's journal and what she had written in the margins. He was thinking about his daughter standing in the hallway with a book. He was thinking about Ruth Abernathy in the east wing of Maplewood and the 6 other storms he had quietly managed from the other side of that fence, and whether the east wing had any elevation above the street grade. It didn't. He knew that. He had measured it once. He turned around. "May, I need to go out. Lock up after me." May nodded the same slow nod she had given him the morning he signed the contract. She trusted him. That was the thing about trust. It didn't make the hard decisions easier. It just made them possible. Gideon pulled on his jacket, picked up Carolyn's journal from the table by the door, and walked past Elena into the rain without another word. The sight was worse than Elena had described. Gideon stood at the edge of the property, his property, or what had been his property, now an open wound of churned earth and halved structures, and read the ground the way he always read it, not with instruments, but with his feet, shifting his weight and feeling what moved underneath him, noting where the water was pooling and where it was moving and how fast. The silt barriers along the south boundary were failing at 3 points. The temporary pump discharge was backing up because someone had run the outlet line uphill by 2 degrees. Small error, total consequence. The fill they had packed into the North Pond Basin was saturated and beginning to migrate toward the greenhouse foundation. And the main gravel channel, the primary artery of the whole system, had been crossed twice by heavy equipment and was compacted in 2 sections that were now functioning as dams, sending water sideways instead of down. Elena stood at his shoulder. Her project foreman, a man named Rick Solano, who had spent the last 6 hours watching things go wrong in sequence, stood on her other side with a flashlight, and the expression of someone who had stopped pretending he knew what to do. "I need 6 men with shovels," Gideon said. "And I need whoever's running that pump to shut it off right now because it's making this worse." Rick looked at Elena. Elena looked at Gideon. "You'll have them in 2 minutes," she said. She made 3 calls in 4 minutes. Gideon was already moving. He worked by memory and by feel. There were no blueprints. There was the journal which he carried but didn't open. He knew what was in it. There was the knowledge that lived in his hands and his feet, and 11 years of walking this ground in every season and every weather. He knew where the channels ran because he had dug them. He knew the stone gradation because he had selected it. He knew the angle of the main run because he had checked it with a line level on a Saturday afternoon in October, while May sat on the back steps eating an apple and asking him questions about why water moved downhill. He directed the crew without raising his voice. First, open the 2 compaction points in the main channel, re-establish flow. Second, redirect the south pump discharge line downgrade, not uphill, not level downgrade, toward the southeast culvert. Third, sandbag the greenhouse foundation on the east and west sides to prevent the migrating fill from reaching the slab. The crew worked. Frank Delaney showed up 20 minutes in with 3 other men from the neighborhood, none of whom had been called, they had just come. They fell in without asking for direction, following Gideon's instructions as they were relayed down the line. Elena worked with them. She did not direct. She moved sandbags, held flashlights, relayed instructions, did what she was told. Her jacket was ruined within the first 10 minutes, and then it stopped mattering. At some point, she stopped being the CEO of Voss Meridian and became simply a person standing in the mud trying to prevent something bad from happening to people who hadn't caused any of this. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was the most honest she had felt in years. The wall failed at 11:47. The temporary barrier along the north cut a section of sheet metal and compacted fill that Rick's crew had erected that afternoon, buckled under the sustained pressure and opened a 6-foot gap. Water moved through it fast, already carrying sediment aimed directly at the low grade that ran toward Maplewood's east foundation. Gideon was at the main channel when it happened. He heard it the specific sound of earth giving way, different from rain, different from runoff. A low and decisive sound, and he was already moving before Rick's shout reached him. He ran the perimeter of the site to the northeast corner, flashlight in hand, and found the gap in 4 seconds. He stood there for 1 second, long enough to calculate, and then he turned to Frank, who was 2 steps behind him. "My father dug a secondary run under the old cypress row," he said. "Northeast corner about 4 feet down under where the root mass was. If it's still open, it'll take this flow and carry it to the culvert before it reaches the foundation." Frank looked at the stump line. if it's still open. Only one way to find out. They dug with 2 other men from the neighborhood, shovels in water that was now ankle deep, working by flashlight in the rain. Gideon counted paces from the corner post his father's measurement, the one passed down without ceremony the way useful things were passed down in families like his, and drove his shovel into the ground at 18 feet. The third strike hit stone. He cleared the opening in 90 seconds. The channel beneath was silted but intact. His father's work older than the garden, older than the greenhouse, older than Carolyn's journal. The water found it immediately, the way water always found a path when one existed, and turned. It moved northeast underground toward the culvert at the corner of the property. The flow toward Maplewood slowed, then stopped. Rick Solano stood at the gap in the barrier with his flashlight and watched the water level drop by 2 inches in 3 minutes. He didn't say anything. He just stood there watching it the way men sometimes stand and watch something they almost lost. The Maplewood East Wing stayed dry. The press statement Elena gave the following morning was not written by Preston Ward. She stood in front of the site at 9 a.m., mud still visible on the ground behind her, cypress stumps in the background, the greenhouse with its cracked panels standing at the edge of the frame, and she spoke without notes. She said that the flooding was a direct result of decisions she had authorized. She said that Gideon Brooks had provided documented warning before the property transfer and that Voss Meridian had disregarded it. She said that the statement issued the previous evening, attributing responsibility to the prior owner, was false, and that she was retracting it in full and without qualification. She announced that the resort development was canceled. She announced that Voss Meridian would fund the full restoration of the property's drainage and ecological systems, establish a maintenance endowment for the Maplewood facility, and compensate affected residents. She announced that the land would be reconveyed to community management under a permanent easement designated as a flood mitigation green space and community garden, operated under the direction of Gideon Brooks for as long as he chose to serve in that capacity. Some people in the small crowd that had gathered walked away before she finished. That was fair. An apology stated well is still just words, and words had a poor track record on Sycamore Street at the moment. The board met that afternoon. It was a difficult meeting. Elena had expected that. She had not tried to manage the outcome in advance, which was unusual for her, and which felt unexpectedly like something close to relief. The garden did not come back the way it had been. Gideon had known it wouldn't. You couldn't replant an 8-year cypress windbreak and have it function next season. You couldn't restore 11 years of soil biology in a month. The specific tomato variety Carolyn had grown, a stubborn heirloom she'd sourced from a seed exchange in Tennessee and tended for 3 seasons before she got sick, was gone from that ground, and no amount of money or goodwill would put it back. Some losses were just losses. Gideon understood that better than most people he knew, but the pond was dug out deeper than before, with Walter Hayes consulting on the stone lining and Gideon doing the layout. The channels were re-excavated and documented for the first time, properly mapped, submitted to the county, filed at the town hall, so that the knowledge was no longer stored only in one man's memory and one woman's handwritten journal. New trees were planted along the east line, shorter than the ones that had stood there before, roots beginning the slow work of becoming what the old ones had been. Frank Delaney built the new gate with lumber he had in his garage. Ruth Abernathy's granddaughter painted the sign. Brooks Community Garden, built to feed, built to protect. Elena came on weekends. She came without staff, without agendas, without the particular quality of attention that she usually carried into every room, the constant low-level calculation of position and leverage and what came next. She came in old clothes and she did what needed doing, which was sometimes digging and sometimes carrying and sometimes just pulling weeds in a row next to whoever else was there. People did not warm to her quickly. She had not expected them to. Trust, she was learning, moved at the pace of the thing that had broken it, and what had broken here had taken 11 years to build. She worked and she waited, and she did not try to manage the pace. One Saturday afternoon in late September, she was restringing a trellis section near the south fence when May came and crouched beside her without being asked and started working the other end. They didn't talk. They worked the wire together. May's hands quick and practiced, Elena's slower and less sure. When the section was done, May stood, looked at the trellis and said, "My mom built the first one of these." Then she walked back toward where her father was working near the pond. Elena stayed where she was for a moment. Then she picked up the wire cutters and moved to the next section. Gideon was raking the mulch bed along the north fence when Elena came to say goodbye at the end of that afternoon. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the section he was working on and then rested the rake and turned. She had her keys in her hand. The light was going gold across the new tree line, the young trees barely chest high, casting the thin shadows of things that had only just begun. "I thought I was buying a piece of land," she said. Gideon looked at the garden, the pond, the channels, the greenhouse with its mismatched glass and its sticking door, the board with his wife's idea on it rendered in a 12-year-old girl's brushstrokes. "It belongs to whoever takes care of it," he said. Elena nodded. She seemed like she was going to say something more. Then she didn't. She walked to her car and Gideon picked up his rake and the garden went on being what it had always been. A place where the work was quiet and the ground remembered everything. The man who does the work without asking for credit, who builds something real with his hands and his years and gets overlooked right up until the moment nobody can do without him. Gideon never gave a speech. He never held a press conference. He just showed up season after season and took care of something bigger than himself. And when the moment came, the ground he had tended stood up for him. That's not just a story about a garden. It's a reminder that quiet, steady work has a value that doesn't always show up on a spreadsheet, but it shows up when the rain comes. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stick around. There are more stories like this one about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in ways the world almost missed. We'll see you in the next one.